Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeremy Edwards, and I serve as a Senior Associate Dean at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you here tonight. Tonight marks the third and final installment in the Pathways to Peace speaker series, and although this initiative started this last winter, the idea for this initiative originated nearly 2 years ago in partnership with the Harris School, Rotary, and the Pearson Institute at the University of Chicago. The success of the initiative thus far has been quite incredible. We've managed to engage some of the world's leading thinkers on the topic of peace, and in fact, the live feed over the course of the last two events was viewed by people in over 130 different countries. This is exactly the sort of reach and impact that we at Harris expect of our work, and we know that this is what you expect of your work at Rotary as well. And I believe it's this mutual pursuit of doing the work that matters the most in the world that has allowed the partnership with the Harris School, Rotary, and the Pearson Institute to be so effective. I would like to briefly acknowledge to start a few of our distinguished guests with us tonight. First, I'd like to welcome the Rotary community. Thank you for welcoming the Harris family to your home today. It is a pleasure to be here. I would also like to welcome the members of the Arch Clump Society, Rotary trustees, and the trustee chairman, Paul Netzel, for being with us tonight. Thank you all for joining us today. I know it is indeed your passionate leadership and commitment to doing good work that makes this partnership possible. I'd also like to thank John Huco, Rotary General Secretary, and President Ian Risley for being with us tonight. And for being supporters of this initiative since day one. This couldn't have happened without all of you. Lastly, I would also like to acknowledge and thank the staff that have made this initiative possible. First, the Rotary staff. All of you are kind of peppered throughout the room. You've been just incredible colleagues to work with over the course of the year, and thank you so much for that. I'd also like to recognize Harris event staff, Ashley Gottlieb and your team, absolute rock stars. This doesn't happen without your effort. And then lastly, Adam McGriffin at the Harris School. The idea for this initiative started nearly 2 years ago on Adam's desk. And I wanted to thank Adam for his vision in making this a reality. So thank you very much. And so with that, I'd like to transition to our topic for tonight. The objective of this initiative all along has been to present the question, what is the state of peace today? And how can we measure it? All of our presenters so far have tackled these important questions from different angles, each shedding light on the importance of the work being done at all levels all around the world on this front. And so tonight we have 4 leading peace builders, and they will share their stories and work addressing the question specifically, how can we sustain the long peace, specifically the overall improvement in global health, global peace, and prosperity since World War II? And how do we keep the peace in the face of some of the toughest challenges that we see today? Climate change, dwindling resources, record numbers of migrants seeking refuge, surges in violence in certain parts of the world, and so forth. These are urgent and necessary questions, and I think we would all agree that's why we're here today. So I'm eager to hear from our speakers tonight, and I hope you are as well. Before we dive into our speakers, I do need to cover, in my role as moderator, I do have to accomplish some logistical details here. We want tonight to be as interactive and as engaging as possible. I think the best solutions are identified through public discourse and engagement. And so we want to know what you think about the state of peace and conflict today. So we're using an app. In true 2018, so we're using an app which allows you to vote on the issues being presented tonight. So to begin, I'd like to pose the first statement. The world is more peaceful today than ever before. Do you agree? Disagree, or are you unsure? Now, this is going to be pretty interactive. See how it's feeding data real time. Look at that. So, not to make our presenters feel nervous, but this might be happening behind the scenes. I think it is important to note, you'll see at the bottom left here, when a question is posed, the questions will be posed after the presenters conclude with their presentation. You'll have 60 seconds to make your choice. And we'll propose a similar question at the end of every presentation. I'll make sure that we stay on time. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you to our first presenter for this evening. Our first presenter tonight is Susan Stigant. Susan currently serves as the Director of Africa Programs in the Middle East and Africa Center at the United States Institute of Peace. Susan's focus is on the design and implementation of constitution-making processes in post-conflict and transitional states. She also serves as an advisor to government officials and civil liberty actors on issues related to constitutional reform in Sudan, Libya, Somalia, and others. And Susan is a graduate of the Duke University's Rotary Peace Center. Please join me in welcoming Susan Sagan.
Good evening, everybody. I'm a little disappointed. I didn't know about the polling, and I would have had some questions to ask you along the way if I'd known. So maybe I'll throw some in as we go along. As I was asked to think about pathways to peace, I wanted to share with you a little bit about my own pathway to working on peace, as well as my own experiences and what I've learned along the way about how you can design constitutions, governments, decision-making processes in a way that might help to lead towards peace, particularly after societies have been deeply conflicted. So my first thought about this took me back to 30 years ago. I remember riding in the car with my dad, and it was a time when the relationship between the First Nations people of Canada and our provincial and federal governments were at some of their worst. And in the town where I grew up, there was a barricade that had been put up between the town and the ski hill. And there were men there wearing camouflage. And this was a complete shock. And I remember the fear driving up to that barricade. And as we got closer, my dad rolled down the window, acknowledged the men who were standing there and the leaders by their name, exchanged some comments and some discussion, rolled up the window and drove on. And so a moment that had been filled with intense fear and apprehension suddenly became personalized. I also thought about my experience 25 years ago when I was landing in South Africa. This was after apartheid had ended. And there was great hope at that moment. People were passionate and had this love affair with their constitution. They had a belief that things would get better because they saw themselves in that constitution. They saw their hopes. They saw that they would be represented, even though in that moment, the challenges still remained great. And I also remembered a moment, again, in Canadian history, when young Canadians flocked to Ottawa as Quebec was making a decision about whether they wanted to remain a part of Canada or not. And the negotiations that took place after that to accommodate and to come up with a system that everybody could buy into. And so all of these things added up to a deep curiosity and a commitment and a sense that there is a way to make decisions. There's a way to structure governments. There's a way to design constitutions so that people see themselves, so that people believe that their lives will be made better by their governments, even if those people have been excluded in the past, even if those people have been neglected, and even if those people have been threatened directly by the governments that are meant to serve them. And so it won't surprise you that when I went on to my master's program and studied as a Rotary Peace Fellow, I started to look further into this question of how can you share responsibility in governance? And if you read a little bit about my past, you also won't be surprised that I wanted to understand negotiations that were taking place at that time between the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in Sudan and the Khartoum government. And at that moment, they were negotiating how they could govern for the next 6 years, and how they could put themselves on a path where South Sudanese could decide whether they wanted to be an independent country or whether they wanted to remain a part of Sudan. And so looking at the theory, I tried to understand, did the peace agreement meet with what the theory told us? And so for academics in the room who've looked at this, I looked and said, is there representation of the different factions in the executive? The answer was yes. Is there representation in a proportional way in the legislatures? The answer was yes. Is there a way for people who are in a minority to override decisions if they need to? And the answer was yes. And all of these things add up to say, yes, it checked the theoretical box. However, even at that moment, it was clear that there was no mention in power sharing theory about security. And we knew that the country essentially had two armies and various factions within those armies. And so any theory going forward would need to address that. There was no recognition of the lack of development in the country. There was no recognition of the deep divisions that had grown up and developed amongst communities. And there was no recognition of the deep trauma that is inevitably the result of years and years of violent conflict. And so as I was thinking about the theory, I was not really satisfied with just doing something on paper and decided I wanted to go and see what was happening in the country itself. And so I got on a plane and I went to South Sudan and I spent 3 months there and had the tremendous privilege to witness the early phases of the implementation of the peace agreement. I sat under mango trees with the leaders who had been charged with drafting the Constitution. It was hot, it was sweaty, it was long days, but they had this tremendous sense of pride that what they had struggled for decades was being translated into rights and guarantees that would lead to a better future for their children. I had a chance to travel with the Minister of Constitutional Affairs as he went around to all of the state governments and told the governors and the members of the state legislature and the judges and civil society and walked them through what was in the Constitution and implored them to read it, to understand it, to own it. And I had the opportunity to witness the first census, the first elections, and the referendum where South Sudanese decided that they would be independent. Just under 4 million people voted, 98% in favor of independence. So if you were tracking, that was much more than 3 months. That actually took 6 years. Sometimes these things turn into something completely unexpected. So at that time, having been on the ground, did my assessment of whether power sharing works or not change? And looking at it from the big picture, yes, the power sharing arrangements got South Sudan to a referendum. And it was a referendum that took place with very minimal violence. There was conflict and there was communal violence that was taking place, but not between the government in Khartoum and the government in Juba. However, it fell short in a number of ways. South Sudanese never had a moment to talk about or agree how they wanted to be governed in the future. There were deep, deep communal divisions that have never been addressed. And when violence broke out in 2013, it was those divisions that were torn apart, and the country was again on fire and in terrible civil war. And so some of us who had been there recognized that there was a threat that things could go badly, but nobody imagined that it could be as bad as it's become today. For those of you who follow a little bit on humanitarian work, the map on the left is done by the Famine Early Response Unit. And they track food insecurity so that humanitarian organizations can try to respond and get to people before they get into a situation of famine. And you don't need to know all of the details, the technical details, but just know that red is bad. Red is the stage before famine. Orange is the stage below that. Yellow is the stage below that. And so this is the map looking ahead into the summer period. Also know that once an area gets into red, it absolutely requires sustained engagement in humanitarian assistance so that people don't move into famine. And if you get into famine, it's almost impossible to reverse those impacts and that effect. In 2013, before the violence broke out, this map was almost all green with a little bit of yellow. This crisis is entirely made by violence, and the violence is entirely caused by men and conflict. The other impact of this violence and this conflict has been a mass displacement of people. Almost 2 million people displaced internally, and almost 2 million displaced outside of the country. And so remember when I told you how many people voted in the referendum? About 4 million? That same number of people are today displaced by the violence and the fighting. I also wanted to note, since I know we've been talking about displacement, that South Sudan is also home to almost 300,000 refugees from other countries. And so the complexity of what's happening in the region, it's not just a one-way direction. So people who are fleeing from Central African Republic, from Sudan, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, are seeking refuge in a country that's fundamentally at war. So what does this mean going forward? At the moment, the region is trying again to figure out a way to end the violence and get people back to peace. And this means that they again need to figure out how they will govern themselves going forward. And so is power sharing, is this another formula that can work again? And my short answer is no. The reason is that people have moved away from the idea of power sharing as representing community interests, making sure that people see themselves in the government, making sure there's a way to respond to what's happening in their communities. It's shifted to who gets which seat, who gets what power, who gets access to the funds, the resources, and the riches of the country that are being lost. And so there needs to be a fundamental rethink about what the pathway to peace looks like. How many of you are hikers in the room? Walkers? Aspiring hikers. All right. So let me use a little analogy here. On your first hike, this is my thinking about what the peace agreement needs to look like going forward. You need a clear map. So the peace agreement going forward will need to have a very clear map of where they're going and how they're going to get there. There needs to be a manageable path. You don't want to take on the West Coast Trail on your first hike. That means you need to have an agenda that is short enough, that can actually be implemented, and that reflects a couple of priorities that will start to transition from conflict and violence to an eventual path towards peace. On your hike, you need willing hikers. We know that governments and power-sharing governments and unity governments only work when there's a minimal amount of trust between people, and they're willing to work with each other to solve problems. On my hikes, I want some guides and some helpers along the way, so that if I come to a path and I have to choose if I'm going right or left, they can tell me which way to go. And we know in peace agreements, there are always decisions to make. And even if we try to minimize those number of decisions, somebody has to help to arbitrate in between. On my hikes, I like somebody who sings. And I'm not going to sing for you right now. But as part of this pathway to peace has to be about how you get there. And it's not just about having the right government in place. It's not just about making the right decisions. It's about making the decisions in a way that start to build the right relationship between those who govern and those who are governed. The accountability and the responsibility to both represent, serve, and protect the population. And finally, the path, for me, at the end, better be a downward slope, because I'm tired. And so the peace agreement needs to have a way that ensures that it will get to the end and can recognize that it's often much harder as you get to the end of an agreement. So let me just end with a couple of reflections a little bit more broadly on how this lecture series has been framed. And I think it's important that there's been an acknowledgement of the depth and the scale of the crisis globally at the moment. But I think it's worth underlining that the global refugee crisis is not really a refugee crisis. This is a crisis of poor governance. This is a crisis of fragile states. These are the factors that are driving refugees. The refugees themselves are a symptom of a broader crisis. And this means that there are no short-term solutions. There are no obstacles that can be put in the way to stop people who are fleeing from the worst of situations from moving. You have to change the environment that's forcing them to leave. And this requires working on relationships. This requires working on relationships between communities and leaders, across different communities, amongst leaders, in the space with education institutions and civic groups like Rotary around the world. And these are the relationships that can fundamentally change how we think about the threats in the world. Finally, these threats won't be addressed from a place of fear. It's really easy to imagine yourself sitting at that barricade with a bunch of men in camouflage and react from a place of fear. But we know that we do best when we work together from a place of inspiration, that we work best when we accompany people in the journey that they're on, when we're inspired by those who have been through the most difficult of circumstances and have new and innovative ideas to take them forward. And we know that young people and citizens are doing this around the world. And it is our job to help to amplify those voices and help to create those new pathways towards peace. Thank you.
Lovely. Let's check in on our how people are feeling here. So the world is more peaceful today than ever. We're about split in the room. Maybe some people are in the middle. Maybe we can sway some of those independent thinkers. Okay, so let's keep in mind we're at 41, 41, 19, and let's see if our next speaker can drive any of those responses in a different direction. Our second presenter tonight is Abdi Ahmed. Abdi is the director of the Immigration Partnership Winnipeg program at the Social Planning Council of Winnipeg. He also previously served as the executive director of the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization of Manitoba. Abdi has extensive experience working with the immigrant and refugee communities in Winnipeg's inner city, focusing mainly on settlement policy, gang, and street crime prevention. And Abdi is also a graduate of Rotary's Queensland Peace Center. Please join me in welcoming Abdi Ahmed.
Hello, everyone. I am not as technologically savvy as Susan, so you will not have to interact with that. Susan's presentation about contemporary conflict brought us to the reality of conflict of today. But I'm here to talk about the next step of conflict, from conflict. And I'm here to talk about refugees. I talk about refugees in hindsight as someone who has been a refugee, grew up as a refugee, having fled my own country, Somalia, when I was the age of 11. And lived in refugee camps in Kenya for 12 years, finally ending up in the east coast of Canada in a town called Antigonish. How many Canadians here? Yeah, okay, excellent. So you know where Antigonish is. And I didn't know anyone, so here comes Chicago. The only person I knew in North America lived in Chicago, who was my classmate back home. And I said, man, I don't know anyone here. He said, I know one friend who lives in Winnipeg, so you may want to go there. So I took the Greyhound 5 days to Winnipeg, where I live today. So, you know, my life has been around refugees. I have lived amongst refugees. I continue to live amongst refugees. And I keep on thinking about the conflict on my back that brings about these refugees. In Manitoba, where I live, we welcome about 16,000 people every year. About 90% of them are immigrants who make the choice to come there. But remember, Manitoba is not a very big place. It has got about a third of the population of Chicago. So 16,000 is such a large number. So 10% of that are refugees. And many of the refugees who make it to Winnipeg have been from conflict situations. Conflict situations that drove them from situations of high tension to situations where they felt relatively in more calmer situation or more peaceful situation. They've crossed borders. They've moved from country to country to find a place so that they can feel peaceful. In Canada, we are a very generous country. Very generous country. We are fond of stepping forward whenever conflict happens, whenever refugees are produced. Remember what happened with the Syrian refugees? My country, very proud to say, they came forward and said, we're going to resettle 25,000 Syrian refugees. Guess how many they resettled? 45,000 and going. So it makes me proud as a country that resettles these refugees. You know, having grown as a refugee, it's amazing. But we still have a lot of work to do because the number of refugees in this world is growing. I saw the picture over there, the question over there on the conflict of today. I will say the conflict of today has not been as big as it has always been. This is the lowest time, I think, in my opinion. I'm not here to influence. But we have the largest number of refugees in the world today. 65 million people displaced from their own countries. 23 million people are of concern to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. 51% of these are young people under the age of 18. And 33% of these are children who are under the age of 10. It makes me think that our future is doomed because 33% of these people who will have been the future leaders of this world are languishing in refugee problems. But the issue is, many of these countries that produce refugees do not manufacture conflicts themselves. You look at Somalia, Syria, all these countries, none of them produces weapons. Nowhere in these countries where guns and weapons are manufactured. We in the West are the ones who are responsible because we produce those weapons that these people use. How many people have cell phones here? Raise up your hand. So look, in the Congo today, the biggest driver of the conflict in Congo is the metal coltan. What is coltan for? It's used to make cell phone chips. So we are playing a big role in driving the conflict in the Congo. My own country is sells arms to the government of Saudi Arabia. It's being used in Yemen. Desperate Yemeni refugees are dying in the Red Sea. So we have a role to play in the conflict. But we are very far away from this conflict, all these conflicts, and we resettle a very minute population of these refugees. So in as much as we cause conflict, we do not shoulder the blame. It's the poor countries that have very little resources themselves having to shoulder all these problems. So back to Canada. Anyway, we're good at resettling refugees. We're good at responding, relatively good, because Kenya, Lebanon, those poor countries are the ones who are hosting the most of the refugees. We're good with words in saying protect refugees, and we're protecting refugees. But our society in my own country, and I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in as much as our population is changing, in as much as we are resettling as many refugees as possible, our society and our systems are not changing with the population change in our country. Demographic change is growing faster than systemic changes in our own country. Children who were born in refugee situations, who have been through conflict, who have never been in school, end up in situations that are not far from where they have been in the conflict situations. Simply because in my country, we place kids according to age because we want kids to be the same. So if you're 15 and you have never been in school, you end up in grade 9. To sit down in a class with a kid who has been in school from grade 1, to learn A, B, C at grade 9 when you don't speak nothing. So you find kids falling into the wrong crowds, gang situations and all this in pretty similar situations from where simply because we haven't prepared ourselves to change the situation. The teachers who teach these kids are not prepared. We don't have a curriculum to respond to their needs. The systems that respond to the needs are not ready for them. The healthcare system that we have is very Eurocentric. We have a lot of refugees who struggle with mental health situations because of the trauma of the past, the conflict. They lost family members in front of them. But when you come to addressing their mental health situations, we still respond with a Eurocentric, European mental health solving problem where you sit across a therapist and you want to resolve some of those things, regurgitate all the things that you have been through. It makes it worse. While back home, you bring family members, relatives, beat drums, talk, make the person lively, and it's different. And the system is not really prepared for these kind of things, for newcomers. The labor market situation is not prepared for refugees who are coming. This morning, I got driven by an engineer. In the taxi that I drove to the airport was driven by a person who was an engineer. He lived in Winnipeg for 8 years. Simply because the regulatory mechanisms that process people's papers to be able to integrate, to contribute to the economic and cultural vibrancy of our country are very archaic. They're 1960 situations, while immigration is 21st century. So we are not yet prepared with the demographic change in our own country. So what am I doing? What, as a Rotary Peace Fellow, because I have been gifted with this opportunity to change lives for society, what am I doing for people? First of all, we have been to the government of Manitoba and said, number one, you have to change the situation in our schools. So we are coming up with a situation where teachers who teach these kids are going to be trained in the universities to respond, equipped necessarily with the tools that they need to respond to these kids. That we create a system that responds to these kids' needs before they're integrated into the normal schooling system, so that they are starting from a position of knowledge, a position where they understand what's going on. That we are talking to the mental health system to be able to borrow the significant traditional practice, healing practices of these communities to be able to respond to the mental health needs of people, of refugees. And thirdly, we also have a problem with the indigenous people who live in our country. Because, you know, the history of how we treated indigenous people in North America is not a pleasant situation. We have gone through colonialism, marginalization, what we call the 60s scoop, where we took away children from indigenous people and put them in culturally cultures that they did not understand. And it's traumatic situations. And indigenous people are looked down upon. What happens to the refugee who's new to Winnipeg? He looks at the indigenous person and he's like, okay, so who struggles to be below me? Who can be below me? And the indigenous person is the person who is picked on to be below the refugee. And what happens is that because the indigenous population, majority of them live in very low-income neighborhoods, and refugees end up in low-income neighborhoods, refugees and indigenous people are conflicting over meager resources of housing. Tensions are existing. Kids are, shooting each other in the inner city. So how do we respond to these kind of things? Because I believe that as human beings, we have the opportunity to be able to create, build bridges between communities instead of creating adversarial relationships between neighbors. So we have come up with a situation where we have created an orientation tool for orientating newcomers about indigenous heritage, the culture of indigenous people, the contribution of indigenous people to making North America, the history of the marginalization and the conflict situation and the colonial situation that has driven indigenous people to be in the situation that they are in today. We are building relationships between young people who are indigenous and young people who are refugees by bringing 60 kids to the camp every year, to summer camp every year, to be able to dialogue about coexistence, love. At the beginning of the 7 days, they hate each other. I don't want to stay with the native. I don't want to stay with that African kid. And after 7 days, oh, I love him. Can we stay 7 days longer? And this is changing lives because will it change lives if we created seeds of peace by using these blocks? We had an African kid inviting the indigenous kid to their home, and the indigenous kid inviting the African kid to their home, and be able to support each other and to see it beyond the differences that they have, to talk about the relationship, the commonalities between them, because many of the refugees who come to Canada themselves have been through issues of colonialism themselves, which the indigenous people have been through, because we need to look at the common things that are happening between us. And then the fourth thing that I wanted to talk about, if I have time, is that to be able to really integrate refugees to the life in Canada and to be able to help them contribute to the cultural, economic vibrancy of my country that I love, is to be able to talk about integration in broader terms of engaging newcomers in the civic process. Because when you look at the civic process, the visibility of people who are of refugee background is very low. Now we have a minister who was a refugee, the person who's in charge with the, keeping the gate closed or open is from my own country, so I'm very proud of it, a former refugee. But we don't have a lot of that. So how can we increase that? In Canada, you take about 6 to 7 years to get what is called Canadian citizenship. And you can only engage in the franchise only if you're a Canadian citizen. You can only engage in the civic process only if you're a Canadian citizen. Many newcomers end up living and staying in the country for more than 7 years, before they become citizens. So for many of the refugees who have been through struggles, if you have lived in this country for 7 years, I have lived in Kenya for 25 years. I didn't vote. I came to Canada. I've lived in this country for 7 years. I didn't vote. It hasn't changed my life. Of what use is it for me to be able to vote? So we have a huge voter apathy amongst newcomers and refugees, mostly refugees, because people don't see the importance. They haven't participated. So one thing that we're working on is to be able to change the Elections Act so that at least new refugees who have lived in the country for 1 year can participate in the municipal civic process to be able to vote on the municipal elections, because that is what affects their lives directly. They take transit, they pay the taxes, they use the recreational facilities, all these kind of things that touches their life from the school trustees and the municipal civic process. So why don't we change the elections process? So we are working with a number of cities across the country to be able to change systems for the Elections Act, so that newcomers who have lived in the country for at least 1 year can vote in the in the municipal elections. This way, number one, we engage people in the civic process. Number two, that they get caught on the idea of leadership, and that we have people who are a visible minority, who are refugees themselves, making decisions for our country. Many of the things that are old, that are still existing, that are difficult to change, will be easy to change when we have this kind of leadership in my own country. And the last thing that I was going to talk about is, recently we've had a huge number of, we call them in Canada refugee claimants. Here in the US, they call them asylum seekers. People who make it to Canada and are looking for protection. So we have had a large number of refugee claimants coming from the US because some of them have genuine feelings of fear of being deported to their own countries from the United States. Some of them are driven by the political pronouncements of the US administration. So we have a huge number. So what happens with our population? As usual, our population wants to put barriers on the border to prevent these people that we don't know. So one of the things that we're doing is to change people's perceptions, because many of the people who make up North America, whatever color you are people who came either running away from conflict, marginalization, poverty situations, to make these two countries how great they are. So what is in it for you to be able to say, erect a barrier and not let them come in? Because refugees make who we are. They change the system. They become the entrepreneurs. They buy property. They become the leaders of the country. The former governor of the Bank of Canada was a refugee. The US Secretary of State was one time a refugee. All these people are refugees. They don't take away from us. They make us. So what we are telling the community is to be welcoming and to improve the public's perception of refugees, because refugees do not take away from us. Refugees make us stronger. Because, the thing is, one thing, and I'm going to leave this with you, is that refugees have been through very difficult times. For example, these refugees who are walking to Canada, some of them walked from Brazil, going through forests and rivers in Central America and coming through the US and coming to Canada. And many other refugees made it from Syria to Germany. So you can't imagine these people, what they have been through to make it to a final place of protection. They are very, very resilient. And they have been through worse times. So provided an opportunity, they make the best out of life and change society for the better. And one thing that has been found out is the crime situations of places, of countries where refugees move in changes drastically for the better. It changes, improves, and people move into there, and it changes lives for people. So why not open countries and our countries for refugees and welcome other people? So we are educating our community to be able to change because we feel that refugees make us. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdi. It's obvious that you have the passion to do the work that you're doing, and I know that everybody deeply appreciates that. I do want to make up for a little bit of time. I want to pose our next question. How much could be added to global GDP by 2025 if we closed the gender gap in work and society? Let's see what we got here. I do think it's important to note the question is kind of relevant because today is National Equal Pay Day, if you haven't noticed that. Excellent. So as that shapes up, I would like to introduce to you our next speaker. Our third presenter today is Hafsa Luck. Hafsa is currently the Deputy Team Lead for the Chief Minister of Strategic Reforms in Punjab, Pakistan. She recently co-drafted the Punjab Protection of Women Against Violence Act in 2016 and the Punjab Women Protection Authority Ordinance in 2017, leading the first of its kind Violence Against Women Center. The center integrates police, prosecution, forensics, medical treatment, and mental health support to survivors of gender-based violence. Hafsa is also a graduate of the Harris School and fellow of the Pearson Institute at the University of Chicago. Join me in welcoming Hafsa Luck.
As Jeremy mentioned, I'm from Pakistan. And believe me, these are some of the monuments from Pakistan, where I'm from. We all know in recent history, Pakistan has been seen in a negative light. We all know about President Trump's tweet at the start of the year, so on and so forth. But I'm so glad that I'm here today representing the positive side and the things that I've been associated with. We've had our share of problems, but I want to show here that there is a realization of moving forward, of taking progressive reforms, and making a better society for everyone to live in. Thank you so much for Rotary Peace Foundation and Harris, Chicago Pearson Institute for having me here and giving this opportunity to me. 2 to 3 years ago, I would not have even imagined that I would be standing at this stage and speaking to all of you and talking about the reforms that I was part of. And a major role in making this happen was basically the Strategic Reforms Unit at the Chief Minister's Office in the Punjab province. Now, this unit was basically formed as a special policy implementation and monitoring unit to come up with new reforms, innovative solutions on some of the existing policy issues that we see that impact everyone on day-to-day life. And then basically the approach or the idea behind this unit was basically hiring fresh undergrads from who recently graduated from undergrad, and then giving them an opportunity and chance, and giving them the power to actually come up with new ideas, innovative ideas, and give them the resources and the authority to actually implement them with the help of the relevant government departments. And also, it basically proves that if you give a small team the type of resources that they need, they can do huge and amazing things. These are just some of the projects that we've been part of, and they range from excise and taxation to police reforms, to even social reforms like establishing graveyards or including chapters in the curriculum, so on and so forth. And then just to conclude to this, we've launched more than 30 projects since 2014, and we're only like a team of 5 to 6 analysts and like one supervisor on top of us who's managing everything. Speaking on these projects, I was mostly associated with projects which were addressing violence against women, how to curb gender-based violence, not only looking at how to provide survivors of violence with streamlined case for process to provide them with justice, but also how to take steps or implement steps which will actually prevent GBV, gender-based violence, to take place in the first place. I'm going to talk about the existing issues in the whole case for process, from the women the victim gets abused till the case for process, so on and so forth, and only because to show that these issues are common to a lot of areas, common to a lot of countries, and the solution or the implementation mechanism that we've come up to actually address this issue can be replicable in other states and other countries as well to effectively address gender-based violence. In fact, UN Women and other international organizations have already dubbed this as a blueprint to effectively address GBV. Violence against women does exist in our society. We all know that. But these are some of the factors that I just want to highlight on why there's a justice delivery gap. And when I say justice delivery gap, that basically means the reporting rate of violence against women and the number of women which actually get justice at the end of the day through court, where the perpetrators are put behind bars or fined, and so on and so forth. And the major issues is that the major issue are these four, basically. The whole case for process, from the minute the victim goes to the police the police station to actually report her case, she's encountered with male police officials who are not gender sensitized to the issue. Like even female officials, a lot of times they'll pass biased comments, so on and so forth. So that's it. Even at the first step, women are faced with such issues that basically hinders their will to actually go ahead and prosecute such crimes. Then they go to the hospital or the medical wing to get the medical examination, which is basically a proof that needs to prove that a sexual assault has actually taken place. Then from there, going to the prosecutors, getting legal aid, and then from there to court, and before that to forensics, getting DNA results, so on and so forth. I mean, this whole case or process is so fragmented, and we've researched that the will of the victim to actually go ahead and prosecute such crimes decreases tremendously within 48 hours. So we needed to come up with a system which basically streamlines this case or process, which looks at not only the investigative side of it to streamline the case or process and increase the conviction rate, which actually increases the deterrence for such crimes in society, but also looks at the psychosocial support for these survivors and how to rehabilitate them, how to provide them training to actually make them independent and assimilate them into the society after that. So basically, we came up with, it was a two-phased solution. The first step was basically coming up with a legislation which is called Punjab Protection of Women Against Violence Act. And then the second step was basically like an implementation mechanism of this legislation called Violence Against Women Centers, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So just to give you like a quick recap, a quick gist of what the legislation is and what it does is, I mean, Pakistan is one of the highly legislated countries in the world with regards to human rights, with regards to women's rights and other things as well. However, the issue is the implementation of these legislations, and I'm sure Pakistan is not the only country which is facing such an issue. So, and also, there are a lot of legislations exist which look at the criminal side of GBV, gender-based violence, which is basically, we have fines, we have imprisonment designated for example, sexual assault, harassment, so on and so forth. But what about those other things that women face on a day-to-day life? For example, just to give you an example, in recent history, women have started participating more in the workforce, and so they're earning. However, there are issues where the earnings of the women are taken away from them by the in-laws, the husband, and so on and so forth, and they have absolutely no way of utilizing them for themselves. That comes under economic abuse, and so or if the survivor or the victim is evicted from her own house at 2 a.m. in the morning and she has nowhere to go, and we've seen such cases. What do you then? Like, you can't really put the perpetrator behind the bars for these things. You need to come up with a solution which actually helps the victim other than just having the perpetrator behind the bars. So we came up with these civil remedies, which are monetary order, protection order, and residence order. Protection order is just like your restraining order. However, how we're enforcing this is through GPS-tracked electronic bracelets. So the perpetrator wears this bracelet so we can properly enforce and track where it is and protect the women, protect the survivors through that. Economic monetary order. to tackle things like economic abuse, but then also provide compensation to the survivors for any medical expenses that they faced or any expenses that they faced while going to the court, and so on and so forth. Residence order is basically tackles the thing about getting evicted from the house. I mean, so this is basically women will be provided shelter, but not only that, they have the right to stay at their own house if they want to. And the perpetrator actually has to leave out the house if the survivor wants, and we can get a court order for that. Or if the survivor wants to stay at a alternative accommodation, it's the responsibility of the perpetrator to actually provide that. So things like that. And as I said, what was lacking before was the implementation mechanism of such thing. Implementation mechanism to implement not the criminal remedies already provided, but also these new civil remedies as well. So what we did was, we streamlined the whole case process. So the Violence Against Women Centers, and we already launched the pilot Violence Against Women Center last March in 2017. We basically have a whole police wing inside. We have a whole medical wing inside with doctors, radiologists, gynecologists inside, even like an X-ray room and an ultrasound room as well. In the police wing, you have your whole operation side, but also investigation side as well. And you even have two lockups, one for female perpetrators and one for male perpetrators, and like investigation room. Then we have a whole prosecution wing with specially trained prosecutors and legal aid advisors, but also like a mediation room in that. Because what we realized when we were researching was that in a lot of domestic abuse cases, victims, if there was not a lot of physical abuse involved, victims or survivors' preference was actually to mediate and be with their husbands because of their kids or whatever other social issues, and did not want to opt for like a criminal remedy, so on and so forth. And looking at the cultural and traditional norms in Pakistan as well, we gave them an option. Okay, if you don't want to do that, you have like a mediation wing as well. But a lot of times you also have custody cases, and then people just want to resolve it with like not going to court. So this mediation wing actually has the power that its orders or whatever the resolution is will be mandated by court as well. It'll be like enforced through the court as well. So things like that. And then a mediation wing also has psychologists. So not only to provide counseling to victims, survivors, but also help them assimilate back into society and like gradually start living their life again. So, and simultaneously, there's a shelter home linked to it as well, and that's in the process of being constructed right now, which basically provides shelter to survivors if they want to, immediate shelter if they want to. So, and the pilot center, as I said, was established last year, and it has a staff of at least 100 people, and there are women. It's a 24-hour all-women center. And to facilitate the victims or survivors, we also have ambulances or vans in there. For example, if a survivor says that, they can call us and say, okay, we can't physically come to the center, but we really want your help. So we, along with our staff, go to their respective place and then have the survivor come to the center for investigation purposes and providing her as much services and facilities as possible. And the second phase of this thing is actually, how do we help them? I mean, fine, we're providing them all these like justice delivery services and giving them psychosocial support and so on and so forth. But what do we do to actually integrate them back into society? What do we do to actually make them independent? What do we do to actually get them out of that situation where they have accepted that violence is okay, right? So what we're doing is we're providing the survivors who get coming out of the centers with training. That training can be IT related. That training can be just like embroidery or clothes stitching. Or the training can be like a beautician, so on and so forth. And then collaborating with various multinational organizations to actually help them get a job in those organizations there, and so they recruit with. So this is like a whole thing that we're also looking at, is because our main aim is, how do you make women independent and help them be a constructive part of the society and the workforce and so on and so forth? How do you make women get empowered that they are part of the peace building processes, so on and so forth, in conflict resolution? The legislation mandates that these centers will be built across the 36 states of the Punjab province, and there are 4 more already in the pipeline. These are like some of the visuals from the interior. That's the reception. So this phrase, basically, it's in Urdu, it says, "Ab aap mehfoos hain," which just basically says that now you're protected, just to kind of show the kind of service that the survivors get here. All these women are the staff which works here is basically specially trained not just in the respective fields, but also gender sensitized. They've gotten gender sensitized training as well. Just to make a note of this, so Punjab is one of the 4 provinces in Pakistan. We've launched this program in the Punjab province for now. However, the other provinces have also reached out and say, okay, this is something that's working, it's on ground. We really want to implement this in our own provinces as well. So now we're working in collaboration with them to have these centers set up in other provinces as well. So since the center was opened last March, we've provided, this is just like some of the statistics, breakdown of the breakdown of the total number of survivors or women that we've received in the center and given age facilities to. So we've received more than 1,500 survivors since March 2016, and that figure score is still January 2018, and we've resolved more than 1,200 cases, and the remaining are still in the pipeline, which are either in the court, waiting for one of the civil remedies to be processed, so on and so forth. And the next phase is basically to have a court, a female-operated court within these centers as well. Just to make a quick point on sustainability, because I know we've been asked a lot, you had the will of the political leadership behind you or the support behind you to actually implement these reforms. What if there's a change in leadership, so on and so forth, and then what if the next government comes in and says, okay, these reforms can't be implemented now? So what we've done is we've basically authored another legislation or passed another legislation, which is called Punjab Women Protection Authority, and because of that, we've basically set up this authority, a legislatively mandated authority, which sole function is basically to oversee the implementation of the legislation that I talked about initially, the civil orders, but also look at the implementation of new violence against women centers which come up, or monitoring evaluation of this existing centers as well. Just to briefly talk about some of the other things that we were doing which work in collaboration with these, with the violence against women reforms, because we basically realized that we really need to look at this whole thing in a holistic manner and target not only the violence part, but also how do we empower women through other projects such as this as well. So this is a project that we launched, which is called Women on Wheels campaign. It's launched in more than 7 districts in the province, and it's being upscaled gradually throughout the province as well. And basically, the idea behind this is to give women the freedom of mobility so that they don't have to rely on their male family members to do everyday tasks like dropping the kids to school or doing grocery themselves or even going to workplaces, so on and so forth. I mean, the women that we've trained more than 3,500 women under this program, and the women we've trained work in nonprofit sector, work in government sector, and various parts of sector, and they basically, the hassle they felt while commuting through public transport or even harassment in such cases, that basically is a solution to all of that. I'm just going to briefly show 2 testimonies from the beneficiaries of this program. This is Sadaf. She was trained last year, and basically this is a story of how the Women on Wheels program actually impacted her. And this is a quote from her husband as well. So, I mean, just to end on this is basically, what I'm basically going to say now, it's never been a more important time to actually have projects such as these or have other projects which curb violence against women or look at women empowerment another way. We've seen studies after studies how role of women is integral in having peaceful conflict resolution or in reducing conflict, so on and so forth. I've done tremendous research on how, and all of you know as well, with the UN Security Council's resolution as well, on how we need to increase the role of women in implementing countering violence extremism programs or preventing violence extremism programs. And you can't really have women be part of such peace-building programs if they don't feel safe in getting out of their houses, if they don't feel comfortable in going to the workforce, if they feel that they're going to be harassed on the way to there, or they can be harassed in their place of work, so on and so forth, or they feel that they're not empowered enough to actually speak up. So these projects, Women on Wheels or Violence Against Centers, and also projects such as including curriculum, including women protection chapters in curriculum from grade 8 through 12, which is something that we're doing as well, to basically start women thinking and men thinking at a very young age that women have these rights, men have these rights, and how to peacefully resolve conflicts as opposed to the violence that we're seeing, so on and so forth. This is another testimony, but I want to show you a quick video after this, which basically is a video on some of the Women on Wheels beneficiaries and how it's really impacted their everyday lives. And basically, this is to show that, okay, you having these big mega reforms which are completely changing the existing infrastructure and setup, and that is important. But also, if you have these reforms, such as just like helping women get trained, helping women get bikes so that they can have an easier commute, and that helps them participate in workplace, so on and so forth. That can have like a real impact on the ground as well. And this video basically shows that. Thank you. It's basically in Urdu, but there's subtitles.
कच्चे पक्के रस्तों पे कब तक धूल में धूप में भटकेंगे
अरे कब तक रोकेंगे हम कल को इनको आगे बढ़ने से अरे कब तक रोकेंगे हम कल को इनको आगे बढ़ने से
अरे घूम रहा है वक्त का पहिया पीछे ना रह जाना नजर जमाने की तुम पे है भूल कभी ना जाना हम राह नहीं हम सफर बनो कल की जाने मेरे साथ चलो हम मिलके रस्में बदलेंगे कल की जाने मेरे साथ चलो
I think because of time, we paused it in the middle. But basically, yeah, these are the reforms that I've been working on. And as I mentioned, that there's never been a more significant, important time to have reforms such as these, which actually impact how women can be part of these conflict resolution and peace building processes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hafsa. I'm going to do my best to be a better moderator and recapture some time, but I do want to make sure that everybody is still staying engaged with our system online. And I do want to introduce you to our next and final speaker. And I do want to make a note, just because we are running up on time, we will not be able to offer up the Q&A, but I will encourage everyone to find our speakers afterwards and approach them with all the questions that I'm sure that you have. Our next and final speaker tonight will be Kristen Hadjic. Kristen is now a counterterrorism fellow with the International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Kristen's expertise is in the fields of counterterrorism, special operations, strategic wargaming, and defense innovation policies. She's also currently in rotation at the U.S. Department of Defense in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Please join me in welcoming Kristen.
I want to thank Rotary International and the Harris School. I am a graduate of the Harris School, so coming here and talking to you kind of feels like nerd prom for me, so I really appreciate this opportunity. I have to start by saying that the views I express today are my own and don't represent any department or agency of the U.S. government. Now that the fun part's over, we can start. So I'm going to talk to you today about cultural inclusion and peace building and special operations. And this is the point at which you say, Kristen, I think you're at the wrong event. We are here to talk about peace. You are coming to talk to us about special operations. I don't understand. So I'm going to try to take time today to change your mind. When I say special operations, I think this is probably what most of you think about. My favorite. Diplomacy is overrated, right? Right? This is what special operations does, right, Kristen? Why are you here talking about peace? Well, I'll tell you what I think about when I think of special operations. This thing. Like every good Harris student, like every good policy wonk, when you talk to me about policy, I think about databases. And one of the first projects I did when I left Harris School was actually working on a database that was full of information about operations going on in Afghanistan. They weren't just any other operation, they were called village stability operations, which were stabilization projects being conducted by Special Operations Unit in Afghanistan. So really, what we're talking about is more like this, right? The projects that I did research on built wells, bridges, they gave people food, clothing, shelter. They helped markets be safe places for the community to meet. And they tried to do all of that by working with the local communities in which they were located. They worked with the State Department, the Department of Agriculture, yes, all of those things, all of those other US governments, but most especially they were working with the local communities around them. And why? Because all of the things we're talking about today is about inclusivity, and it's about inclusive leadership. Because in order to make policies that are effective, they must include the people that these policies are going to impact every time, right? So this is what Special Operations tries to do. This is their ethos. So around the same time that I'm working on this project, the Special Operations community and the leaders realized that although their projects are having some impact, they're not really meeting their full potential. And why? It's because they are missing 50% of the population in Afghanistan. Which population is that? It is the 50% of the population that is prohibited from talking to men in general, and that is the female populations in Afghanistan. So they were having trouble finding projects that really meted the needs of everyone in the communities. The problem is, the reason why there weren't any women in those Special Operations Unit is because the Department of Defense had banned those positions for women. So the Department of Defense had to make a special dispensation to Special Operations Command in order to find women, train them who are already in the military, and attach them to Special Operations units. They called them the cultural support teams because we always need a good acronym in the Department of Defense, so we called them CSTs. Right here, this woman is a CST. She's working with children in a local community. It's another example. This woman is also a CST member. She is talking with this community about medical needs and trying to figure out what kind of medicine that they need in order to help them recapture the lives that they had before conflict entered their communities. This was so successful that we started hearing about it. We in the US, we started hearing about what these women were doing and all of the great things that they were doing to help communities overseas. This was great, except when they came back to the US, the Department of Defense said, hey, you weren't supposed to be doing that job. So you're not going to get the same promotions, and you're not going to get the same benefits of your male counterparts that were doing the same jobs. So I was talking about this with some of my friends, and around that time, the Department of Defense started realizing that their policies were not keeping up with the realities of conflict, right? They needed more inclusive membership. They needed more diversity at the table when they were doing these kinds of projects overseas. And this is kind of the reality of current state of conflict. So this is happening in more than one place. So the Department of Defense asked their senior leaders to study it. And the Department of Defense, they call a bunch of people like us, and they say, hey, study women. We'd like to know what women do, how women do things, where they do things, and all that sort of thing. Okay, sure. I mean, women have been serving in the military since the Revolutionary War, but okay, let's study women some more. The only issue with this is the people that were being asked to make this decision were senior leaders in the military. So many of them not only did not have specific experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, many of them had never deployed with women, and many of them had never led women. So we're now asking a very homogeneous group in order to make a decision about something of which they had no experience. So I got together with some of my colleagues, and in 2014, we started a nonprofit called No Exceptions, based on the idea that we wanted to create a platform for the voices of people like the CST members and like people who deployed with women who could talk to senior leaders about their experience serving with women in Afghanistan. It's a very radical idea. Let's just bring people to the table who actually had the experience and ask them what they think. So in December 2016, then Secretary Leon Panetta came up and made his announcement.
And today, I'm announcing my decision not to make continued exceptions. That is, to proceed with opening all these remaining occupations and positions to women. There will be no exceptions. This means that as long as they qualify and meet the standards, women will now be able to contribute to our mission in ways they could not before. They'll be allowed to drive tanks, fire mortars, and lead infantry soldiers into combat. They'll be able to serve as Army Rangers and Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Marine Corps Infantry, Air Force parajumpers, and everything else that was previously open only to men. And even more importantly, our military will be better able to harness the skills and perspectives that talented women have to offer.
So the Secretary is making a wild pitch for inclusive leadership. Let's bring everyone to the table. And of course, we have a whole body of literature now that says that more diverse groups make better decisions, they have better outcomes, and it's better for the entire community. Okay, Kristen, you still are not talking about peace. Okay, fair. So the reason why this is important is because this helps special operations units do what they've always done, but now they're able to do it even better because this is one more voice at the table. And what I would like to offer to you is I'd like you to think about special operators as the white blood cells of our geopolitics, okay? Now, I'm not the only one who's thought about this. There are two academics in New England Complex Systems Institute who have written an article about this, and they say, let's think about the globe as a human body. Let's think about human civilization as a system of social tissues netted together. And in that system, special operators serve as white blood cells. And here's why. Because they have capabilities which enable interaction with local cultures and people, because they have persistent presence, which fosters cultural understanding, and because they have autonomy, which enables them and gives them flexibility to respond to any disturbances that they see, okay? This is just an artist rendering of flight patterns. This is just a visual for you to think about how we conceive of networks, right? This is what we're talking about, networks upon networks and how they fit together. So this is what special operations does. Persistence presence doesn't mean that we're fighting everywhere all the time. We have 7,000 special operators deployed overseas. There are 12,000 operators in the US supporting them in those operations at any given time. The majority of those places, they are actually training people. They are not shooting people, they're training them and they're giving skills so that they can defend their own borders and they can protect their own people. So here we have a picture of a Marine captain. He's doing an exercise with the Moroccan military. This woman next to him is from the Utah National Guard, and she's actually interpreting for him in this instance. This is another picture of a Green Beret who's working with soldiers from the Sudanese People's Liberation Army. They do joint, combined exercise training. They give them tools and capabilities that they would not otherwise have. This helps create stability and helps them protect their own people. So another thing that this persistence presence enables is actually disaster response and humanitarian assistance. I'm going to give you 2 examples that I think will try to demonstrate this. The first one was in 2015. In Kathmandu, there were 2 special operations detachments that just happened to be there in order to do some high altitude mountain rescue operations, trying to give the Mahabir Rangers skills to support search and rescue missions that they might have to do in their local community. The day that those detachments landed, Kathmandu experienced a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. And it basically shut down the entire mountain. There were trekkers on the mountain. It affected the local community. But the fact that those SOF units were there, they were immediately able to start search and rescue missions. They were starting to do initial assessments about infrastructure that had been downed, where they thought people were located, and what had to be addressed first. They were able to establish comms, and they were able to create space in the infrastructure for other international humanitarian assistance, for United Nations folks, for NGOs, and for the local law enforcement to be able to get to where the rescue and the need was greatest. So this is not from the earthquake, but this is an example of a high altitude mountain rescue operation. This is from another exercise that was happening in Nepal with the Mahabir Rangers. The other example I'd like to share with you actually happened in the Philippines in 2013. It was Typhoon Yolanda. That's what the U.S. calls it, is Typhoon Yolanda. We actually had a Joint Special Operations Task Force in the Philippines for 11 years at that point, 11 years. And so they already had relationships with the local and national law enforcement and force protection organizations on the ground. And it was in 2013 when the typhoon hit. It was the largest and strongest typhoon in Philippine history. And they were immediately able to start search and rescue operations. And it's this kind of first responder ability, and the fact that they already had relationships established with the Philippine law enforcement and search and rescue organizations that they were able to be so effective. There's one more thing that's often overlooked in this conversation that I would like to point out to you, and I think this is a great crowd. I think you guys would be receptive to this, and that is when people leave the military, these skills don't go away. They still want to serve. And they still want to make an impact. And so many veterans leave and they actually end up starting their own NGOs. Team Rubicon is a fantastic example of this. There were 2 Marines when the hurricane hit Haiti in 2010. They were like, well, I mean, we know how to do this. Why can't we just go there and help out? And from the initiative of those 2, they have created a nonprofit that has now volunteered over $10 million worth of volunteer service across the globe and across the US, just by using a network of veterans who are already here in the US doing day jobs. You know, they've all moved on to civilian life, but they still have the desire to serve, and this is how they can fulfill that desire. So this is an angiogram, but I just want to bring it back to this idea that we are all part of these networks, right? And we are all part of these different social tissues, right? Today we have 2, right? We have Rotary International and we have the Harris School. And this is just one microcosm of networks that have come together. What I would like to share with you is that we all have our own mini networks that we can affect today, right? Going back to these flight patterns, this is Southwest, this is the city of Atlanta, and this is North Atlantic area. My point is that we all are a part of communities today that can be leveraged to have a positive impact, and it's just a matter of doing what all of these organizations that have been talked about today have done, what Special Operations have done, what No Exceptions has done, and what we're all capable of doing, identifying the networks that you can empower and leverage them to do good things. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen. In closing, I would like to first thank our experts and our speakers tonight, Kristen, Susan, Abdi, and Hafsa. Thank you so much for being here with us. I know that some of you have traveled quite a bit, and we're so thankful for all of you being here. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I do think that we've covered a lot of information tonight, and I think that we've covered some important ground throughout the course of this speaker series, throughout 3 events. And I know that in talking with my colleagues at the Harris School and at the university, we're quite proud of this partnership in a lot of ways. And I think it's fair to say, and speaking on behalf of my colleagues, the events that we've accomplished and executed together this year have been some of the best events that we've had at the Harris School all year. And so thank you so much for being just wonderful partners. I learned a long time ago from my own academic mentor, Michael Diamond. Some of you might know that name. He was leading a lot of the Polio Plus efforts with Rotary. He was my academic mentor. And I remember him telling me, academic institutions in many ways can solve problems, but we can't do it on our own. And neither can Rotary. We do it better together. And I think this is a wonderful example of what that looks like. And so in closing, I would like to now introduce you and welcome to the stage the chairman of the Rusty Trustees, Paul Netzel. Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Honorable friends, guests, and fellow Rotarians, it's my great pleasure on behalf of the Rotary Foundation, of Rotary International, and our president, Ian Risley, to provide the concluding remarks to this 3rd and final event in the Pathways to Peace series in partnership with the University of Chicago, Harris Public Policy School, and to remind us that last September, we set out to explore new paradigms for how we can understand and respond to conflict. And although tonight's events marks the conclusion of this particular speaker series, we hope it's just the beginning of many more joint efforts as we pursue peace. As the stories we've heard tonight prove, we can better understand how each of us can make a difference. And did we hear some terrific stories? So it is now our responsibility to take action. That has always been the approach of Rotary International and Rotarians around the world. We have been long champions of peace building, international cultural exchanges, global understanding, along with the support and engagement of students all over the world. In 1936, Rotary's Institute of International Understanding program was created. Rotary's concept was that world peace begins with enlightened public opinion at home. In Havana in 1940, Rotary members crafted the framework for the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in 1945, 47 Rotarians served as delegates, consultants, and advisors at the San Francisco Conference when the United Nations Charter was written. And Susan and I would mention that I don't think they had the luxury of a mango tree to sit under while they were doing this, by the way. But most of our work for peace doesn't happen at conferences. It happens through personal relationships that are developed over time and across national borders and disparate cultures. In 2002, we launched the Peace Centers program, which develops leaders who become catalysts for peace and conflict prevention and resolution. Through our extraordinary global network of members, we're in over 200 countries and geographic territories all around the world. Rotarians are able to locate the very best students from every continent and offer them a rigorous and practical education in peace building. More than 1,150 Peace Fellow alumni are now working in over 100 countries worldwide, and we're adding about 100 new Rotary Peace Fellow alumni every single year. And we just had a meeting today of our trustees talking about our future plans through 2030, and we intend to expand this program, so we'll increase that number, no doubt, as time goes on in the near future. And of course, tonight, you heard from two of our exceptional Rotary Peace Fellow alumni. Today, all of our work at Rotary, from fighting disease to supporting education, is related to developing the conditions that allow for peaceful societies to flourish. Even so, estimates say that we need to invest more than 6 times the current funding for global peace building in order to effectively prevent the increase in conflicts. So it's time for new approaches, as our speakers have indicated and demonstrated by virtue of their great presentations. We also know that we don't do this alone, as Jeremy was just saying. We know that if a project as ambitious as global peace building is to be as successful as we have been in our signature project of eradication of polio, it will require bold partnerships with the very best in the field. And I can't think of a better one than the Harris Center. Through the incredible faculty and research that the Harris School of Public Policy has provided, we can fill a critical gap in helping to identify the new strategies to create a more peaceful world. And so, Dean Edwards, although this is the final event in this particular speaker series, I hope it is the first of many more projects that we might be able to collaborate together on, which advance our shared commitment to understanding peace and taking action to see that peace is sustained. Now, I'd like to declare that the formal part of this evening's program is concluded, and I invite all of you to join us for a reception out in the atrium. Thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to the next time we have a chance to get together. Thank you.